I do believe this is going to be chapter 10.1 because I got to be somewhere in a little while. Chapter 10.1, God's angels are Luciferian forces. The still vexed Bermudes, William Shakespeare. In spite of similarities, humanoids can never be explained or understood in solely human terms. Some researchers go a step further. Humanoids cannot be explained in terms of other planets and galaxies either. This leaves us only with two options. They are angelic beings and thus benign, or demonic entities and thus malign. But which one of the two? Saviors from the skies or demons from the depths? Do they resemble the good aliens of Spielberg's Close Encounters or the bad Martians of Wells' The War of the Worlds? God's angels or Luciferian forces? If their physical characteristics do not supply the key, then we must look at their moral attributes to determine their identity. Benign beings? Benign beings? Benign beings? Question mark. Some assert that they are benevolent. These visitors are our friends. They are engaged in nothing less than a mission to help us. The saucer people are our first line of defense, there to protect us. They are a galactic peace corps to save us from ourselves. I wonder if they have something for oversweating. To argue their case, advocates of this theory underscore the following items. There is no known case where these beings have deliberately caused the death of anyone. A powerful argument if true, but as we shall see later, an argument that is open to serious doubt. There is no known case where one of their spacecrafts has ever collided with a vessel from Earth. Again, open to doubt. There is no known case where space beings have ever attempted to invade and subdue our planet, although undoubtedly possessing the power and know-how to do so. To bolster these arguments, we are further reminded of the occasions when these beings have been friendly toward the humans they have encountered. They have even waved to them and invited them aboard their craft. What is more, these beings at times have revealed a shyness and a reticence that made them retreat into their craft when humans rejected their invitation. It has even been suggested that they are not only friendly in their intentions toward us, but that they are actually here to save us. They wish to warn us of impending calamities and catastrophes, especially if we continue playing with our nuclear bombs and missiles. What other reason could there be for the great increase of UFO sightings since 1947? It was just before then that atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The carnage and destruction was such that these alien beings rushed here to warn us. John Keel writes, on August 3, 1958, ham radio operators throughout the U.S. reportedly picked up a strange broadcast on the 75-meter international band. A male voice purporting to be Nikoma from the planet Jupiter warned his listeners that the American bomb test could lead to world disaster. He spoke for 2.5 hours in English, German, Norwegian, and his own language, which was described as a kind of musical gibberish. Dr. Clifford Wilson elaborates. The theory is that this atomic explosion, forced blast of energy out into space, detected by sensitive instruments of super-intelligent beings observing us from other worlds. Investigative expeditions have been sent to Earth to warn the foolish inhabitants about the danger of continuing such activities. According to those who argue in this way, messages given to contactees have centered on problems Earth is facing if it continues to experiment with forces of nature in this way. Oh, it's hot. Space Brothers? Some explain that the great balls of light that these extraterrestrial beings send out into the atmosphere are actually there to neutralize dangerous atomic radiation resulting from man's experiments. Since human scientists insist on poisoning Earth's atmosphere, these superintelligent beings are engaged in minimizing their effect. Indeed, it has been suggested that their concern for us is such that they have already assembled a large fleet of UFOs in order to evacuate people from this planet before some dreadful catastrophe occurs. Many ufologists claim that spacemen are standing by with thousands of machines ready to save enough of their Earth colonists so that they will be able to relaunch an Earth-type civilization in another space home already prepared for them. Some Bible students have picked up this idea, interpreting such an invasion as the rapture. Furthermore, they interpret the messages received by some of the contactees as parallel to the predictions of Scripture. Indeed, their coming to earth in itself has been interpreted as fulfillment of prophecy, and even those who have ceased to believe in divine intervention seem to have no difficulty in believing in extraterrestrial intervention. Add these facts together, they tell us, and they demonstrate quite clearly that these beings from space are indeed our friends and may one day be our deliverers. Ted Owens of Cape Charles, Virginia, claims that he is Earth's principal intermediary for space intelligence meetings, assisting mankind throughout the centuries. He is the man who got a lot of publicity in the May 3, 1979 issue of Sports Illustrated. Owens decided to cast a spell upon the Baltimore Colts and then charge $100,000 to unhex them. Now, asked Sports Illustrated, was it Owens' fault that Johnny Unitas tore his Achilles tendon, Tom Mack got appendicitis, and Sam Haverilik sprained an ankle? Later, when a Philadelphia writer challenged Owens to prove he could do something, the PK man announced he would hex Tom Witashek of the Eagles, and within 15 minutes, Witashek was dismissed from the game for fighting. If one believes in this sort of thing, obviously these powers are not uniformly benign, but far more important than these speculations are a number of formidable facts that have to be taken into account. Facts that could well convince us that extraterrestrials are not benign but hostile. Hostile visitors. Let us take a closer look. Consider first deliberate cases of outright abductions that have happened from time to time. Mark Albright and Brooks Alexander, in their excellent article in the SCP Journal, August 1977, refer to what can be considered a prototype of abduction encounter. It happened in 1971 near the Superstition Mountains of Arizona to a man called Brian Scott. He was on a camping trip when he found himself levitated into a large UFO. In the report of a doctor who directed Scott's hypnotic regression, he states that Scott had an authentic and detailed memory of what happened. The subject finds himself in a small room, paralyzed and unable to resist. Suddenly, several 7-foot-tall beings enter and undress him. The beings are ugly, with sloping shoulders, crocodile-scaled skin, elephant-like feet, and hands, with 3 fingers and a recessed thumb. Heavy fog or mist is everywhere. 2 of the 7-foot beings station themselves at consoles of some kind, and a third stands beside a pole on which there is a movable box with many tiny colored blinking lights. The subject experiences a series of uncomfortable, if painless, sensations from his feet upward. He senses he is bleeding. He urinates. He feels water run from his stomach. He feels his chest open, and he thinks his heart has left his body briefly. Finally, head feels pulled violently. The subject detects a distinct, unpleasant odor. Then from across the room, out of the fog, comes a 9-footer, and apparently communicates telepathically with the subject without moving his mouth. A message is communicated to the subject. Then the subject experiences an out-of-body trip. The message is a combination of vague philosophical statements, general information about the aliens' origins and purpose, and a promise that they will return. Space snappings. Worse than abductions have been the cases of space snappings. There is evidence of a number of adults and even children who have disappeared, never to be seen again. Here is just one example. Lieutenant Cody and Ensign Adams were 2 naval officers who disappeared off the California coast in 1942. They were in a small blimp at the time, watching out for enemy submarines. The crews of a number of patrol boats and fishing smacks in the area saw something happen to the blimp that was incredible. They saw it suddenly shoot straight up into the air in a manner that was physically impossible. At about 2,500 feet, it leveled off and then drifted aimlessly toward the coast, where it finally touched ground about 2.5 hours later. Everything inside the gondola was in a perfect order, except that the 2 officers were not in it, and they have never been found since. What is strange is that the blimp had been under close observation all this time, and the men had neither fallen nor jumped out. Nonetheless, they disappeared. From an entirely different source comes this intriguing admission by the foremost Russian authority on UFOs, Dr. Felix Zeigel. He contends that UFOs may have frightened, harassed, and possibly even killed Russian cosmonauts on their mission. It is obvious that they are not respecters of persons or nations. Another frightening feature resulting from contact with extraterrestrials is the number of contactees who have died shortly afterward. Some of them from leukemia, a disease that can be caused by radiation poisoning. What compounds the tragedy is that a number of these contactees were comparatively young, hardly an act of friendliness. Major Donald E. Kehoe lists a whole catalog of incidents where UFOs have been responsible for deaths and injuries to humans, and John Weldon supplies further documentation accusing UFO occupants of being responsible for aggravated assaults, burnings by direct ray focus, radiation sickness, murders, abductions, pursuits of cars, assaults on mobile homes, paralysis, cremations, disrupting power sources, etc. And to leave us in no doubt whatsoever, he adds that even UFO investigators have succumbed to sudden and mysterious deaths, others to suicides and nervous breakdowns. I'll stop right here. I'm going to go back to where the list of things UFOs have done. Pursuits of cars, assaults on mobile homes. We've heard of pursuits of cars in various TV shows and even in X-Files and all that, and just from L.A. Marzulli and other people. The assaults on mobile homes. I'm going to leave the person nameless that I know, but in the 70s, I was told a story about something on the top of the mobile home. The mobile home was not in an area where a large animal would have jumped on the top of the home. And besides, it would be kind of difficult for it to have done. However, it sounded like something large was walking on it. Nobody could have climbed up there either. Remember, this book was written in the 70s, and a lot of this stuff started ever since Roswell, but the 70s were a big time for the UFO phenomena. And it continues on, of course, now. But I distinctly remember hearing that story. And there was another story about a sighting actually before we lived where we live in this area that you see in the background, but another part of this surrounding little spot area, about an actual sighting. Now, both persons that witnessed that sighting are deceased, but it was in the 70s. I know what you're thinking, hippies and all that stuff and smoking pot or whatever, but no, this was not happening. These people did not do that when they saw this. Anyway, let me carry on here. Alright. Some would add to this list the horrible mutilations of animals witnessed in a number of Midwestern states. I'll refer to Skinwalker Ranch, The Secret of Skinwalker Ranch on the History Channel. Some crazy stuff happened to some cows there. In the 18-month period leading up to the January 1977, there were 700 such mutilations. Most of these occurred at nighttime and in isolated areas. No cause of death could be determined. No trace or tracks of the killer could be found. And in many cases, the animals seemed to have been dropped from the air. The sight of the mutilations were such that they froze the blood of those who found them. Hardly the work of benign space brothers. Mid-air collisions. In spite of the claim made that there have never been a collision between a spacecraft and an Earth vessel, Robert DeBerry, in his lecture From Outer Space to Earth, cites two such accidents. Both cases involved C-118 transports. They collided in midair with UFOs, but little publicity was given to the fact. The first collision occurred on April 1st, 1959, near McCord Air Force Base in Washington. In this accident, the pilot and the two crew members were all killed. The second collision was in 1960 over Wisconsin. There were 7 persons aboard the plane, but only 2 bodies were ever found. The other 5 had disappeared into thin air. It is significant that in both collisions there were apparently no damage to the UFOs. To these 2 collisions, one could add the case of the F-89 jet interceptor that was dispatched from Kinross Air Force Base, Michigan, on the night of November 23, 1953, to intercept a reported UFO in the area. Lieutenant Felix Monsell Jr. was the pilot, and Lieutenant R.R. Wilson his radar observer. They were guided to the UFO by ground control intercept radar station. They reported back to ground control that they had spotted the UFO and described it as circular in shape and bright bluish white in color. They then trailed the UFO over Lake Superior at 500 miles per hour. Minutes later, the ground control intercept controller was shocked to see the blips of the Air Force jet and the UFO suddenly merge. The F-89 and the UFO were locked together. Moments later, both vanished from the radar screen, and there has been no trace of the two airmen or of the F-89 ever since. That's scary. More recent was the case of the Cessna 182 cruising over the Bass Strait, some 130 miles south of Melbourne, Australia. This was on the night of October 21st, 1978. The pilot, Frederick Valentich, suddenly saw an unusual UFO approaching from behind, and a few minutes later, he and his aircraft had disappeared for good. When Valentich first saw the mystery spaceship, he radioed the Melbourne Flight Service Control and described his pursuer as a green light and sort of a metallic light on the outside. As the object came closer, he radioed that he could see 4 bright lights. Some of his last words were, "It isn't an aircraft. Melbourne, it's approaching from due east towards me, flying at a speed I cannot estimate. It is a long shape. Cannot identify more than that. Coming for me right now. The thing is orbiting on top of me." He then reported that the engine of his plane was choking. Metallic scratching replaced the pilot's voice. Complete silence. All these 4 cases involve direct mid-air collisions between airplanes and UFOs. In addition, there are cases which report the complete disappearance of Earth vessels, leaving no trace of them. Both airplanes and ships have disappeared, never to be seen or heard from again. I think I will continue the rest of this later because it gets into the Bermuda Triangle, and that's always an area of interest. Y'all have a great day or evening.